My name is Sarah. I am 42 years old, and I was wiping down the sticky counter of my struggling little cafe when three sleek black town cars suddenly pulled up to the curb outside. My heart sank into my stomach, thinking it was the corporate landlords coming to shut me down and throw me out on the street. Instead, a tall man in a custom-tailored suit walked through the door, followed by two silent assistants. He looked around the modest room, his eyes scanning the worn-out booths, before locking his intense gaze right onto me. I wiped my hands nervously on my apron, my mind racing through the unpaid bills sitting on my desk. But when he spoke, he didn't ask for the rent money or hand me an eviction notice. He reached into his jacket and placed a faded, crumpled paper napkin on the counter. It was the exact same napkin I had wrapped a warm sandwich in 5 years ago on a freezing, stormy night when I risked absolutely everything I had to feed a starving homeless man who had wandered into my old workplace. The suit-wearing stranger looked at me with tears welling up in his eyes, took a deep, shaky breath, and revealed a truth that made my blood run completely cold. Before I tell you what this powerful CEO said to me and how that single crumpled napkin completely turned my entire universe upside down, I would really love to know where you are listening from. Please drop your city or state in the comments below, because it always warms my heart to see how far my story is traveling and connecting with people all over the country. Now, to truly understand the absolute shock and weight of that moment, I need to take you back 5 years. Back then, I was a very different person. I was 37 years old, completely exhausted, and barely keeping my head above water in a world that felt incredibly cruel. I worked the graveyard shift at a rundown diner on the edge of town, a place where the neon sign always flickered and the coffee was always slightly burned. I was a single woman trying desperately to scrape together enough cash to keep the heat on in my tiny apartment. Every single night was a desperate fight for survival, and I was terrified of losing the one terrible job that was keeping me off the streets. I worked alongside my only real friend at the time, a 45-year-old line cook named Marcus. Marcus was a gentle giant, a man who had seen the roughest parts of life, but still kept a warm, encouraging smile on his face. He knew exactly how close I was to losing everything. We were both under the heavy, abusive thumb of our manager, Mr. Henderson, a bitter 60-year-old man who cared only about his profit margins and absolutely nothing about human beings. Mr. Henderson had a strict, unforgiving rule. Any leftover food was to be thrown directly into the dumpster at the end of the night, and any employee caught giving it away would be fired on the spot without a second thought. He was a tyrant who loved to make us suffer every shift. He literally poured strong chemical bleach on the trash bags just to make sure no hungry person could ever scavenge a meal from his garbage. It was a cruel, heartless policy, and Marcus and I hated it with a passion, but we were both far too broke and frightened to ever dare challenge him. We just kept our heads down, flipped the greasy burgers, wiped the sticky tables, and prayed we would make enough in tips to survive another week of misery. It all started on a miserable Tuesday night in November. The weather was absolutely horrific. A massive, violent storm had rolled into the city, dumping freezing rain and howling winds that rattled the large glass windows of the diner. The streets outside were completely empty, washed out by the torrential downpour, and the bell above the front door had not rung in hours. The silence in the restaurant was heavy and depressing for us. Marcus was in the back kitchen scrubbing the grill, and I was leaning against the counter, staring out into the dark, wet parking lot, counting the agonizing minutes until my shift finally ended at 4 in the morning. I was doing the math in my head, realizing that the $3 meager in my tip jar would absolutely not be enough to buy my groceries for the week. I was lost in my own miserable thoughts, feeling completely invisible to the world, when the front door slowly creaked open, letting in a violent gust of freezing wind, and a figure that immediately broke my heart. An elderly man stumbled inside the diner. He looked to be in his late 70s, fragile and shaking violently from the freezing cold. His clothes were completely soaked through, dripping muddy water onto the clean linoleum floor. He did not have a winter coat, only a thin, torn flannel shirt. That thin shirt offered zero protection against the bitter, biting storm outside. His face was pale, his lips were a terrifying shade of blue, and his eyes had this distant, extremely confused look, like he had no idea where he was or how he had even gotten there. He didn't ask for money. He didn't even speak a single word. He just stood near the door, hugging his thin frame, staring at the warm fruit pies in the glass display case with a look of such profound, desperate hunger that it physically hurt my chest to watch. I could hear his empty stomach rumbling from across the quiet room. He was starving, completely exhausted, and looking like he might collapse onto the hard floor at any given second. Marcus popped his head out from the kitchen window, took one look at the shivering old man, and immediately gave me a severe, frantic warning look that made my stomach drop. "Sarah, please do not do it," Marcus whispered loudly, his eyes darting nervously toward the manager's office in the back. "Henderson is still in there doing the books. If he catches you feeding him, you are out on the street. You know he doesn't play around. Just ask the guy to leave before we both get in trouble." I knew Marcus was absolutely right. I knew that I was exactly one missed paycheck away from being entirely homeless myself. My rational mind screamed at me to follow the rules, to protect my own livelihood, to just point to the door and tell the poor man we were closed for the night. But as I looked back at the old man, who had now sat down cautiously in a corner booth, shrinking into himself as if trying to disappear, I felt a massive, painful lump form in my throat. I saw my own late grandfather in his tired, frightened eyes, and my heart completely shattered. I saw a human being who was suffering deeply, and I realized with absolute certainty that I could not just throw him back out into the freezing storm to die alone. I took a deep breath, ignoring the loud warning alarms ringing in my own head, and walked over to his booth. I forced a warm, welcoming smile onto my face, even though my hands were shaking badly with anxiety. "Hi there," I said softly, not wanting to startle him. "It is a terrible night to be out in the cold. Let me get you a cup of hot coffee to warm you up." The old man looked up at me, his eyes wide and fearful, as if he expected me to hit him or yell at him to get out. He slowly reached into his soaked pants pocket and pulled out a single crumpled silver dime, holding it out to me with a badly trembling hand. That tiny, pathetic gesture completely broke the last remaining piece of my professional resolve. He was offering everything he had in the world just for a moment of warmth. I gently pushed his hand back down, shaking my head with tears forming in my eyes. "No, sir," I whispered, fighting back my emotions. "Tonight, the coffee is on the house, and I think you need a really good hot meal to go with it." I walked quickly back to the kitchen, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Marcus was shaking his head vigorously, looking at me like I had completely lost my mind. "Sarah, you are going to get fired tonight. Is this really worth your only job?" he asked, his voice full of genuine, deep concern for me. "I can't help it, Marcus," I replied, grabbing a fresh loaf of bread and slicing a thick piece of roast beef. "If I kick him out, he will freeze to death on the pavement. I will pay for it out of my next check. I really don't care what happens to me." I quickly assembled the biggest, warmest sandwich I could possibly make. I piled on the hot meat, melted thick slices of cheddar cheese, and poured a giant bowl of steaming tomato soup. I wrapped a portion of the sandwich in a standard diner paper napkin to keep it warm for him. I plated everything up carefully, grabbed a steaming mug of black coffee, and carried the heavy tray out to the dining room, praying silently that Mr. Henderson would stay locked in his office for just 10 more minutes. When I placed the hot food in front of the old man, he let out a soft, shaky gasp. He looked at the soup, then at the sandwich, and then up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disbelief. He didn't devour it like a wild animal, which is what I fully expected from someone so obviously hungry. Instead, he bowed his head respectfully and closed his eyes for a brief moment. He took a slow, deliberate bite, and tears began to mix with the cold rainwater on his wrinkled cheeks. I sat down in the booth across from him, just for a moment, to make sure he was okay and wasn't going to choke. "My name is Sarah," I told him gently, offering a kind smile. He chewed slowly, swallowed hard, and looked at me with those deep, incredibly sad eyes. "Arthur," he whispered, his voice raspy and weak from the cold. "I lost my way. I can't find my house." He seemed so incredibly confused, so terribly lost in his own mind. I realized right then that he wasn't just a regular homeless man who lived on the streets. He was someone who was suffering from severe memory loss, someone who had slipped through the cracks of a busy, uncaring world. As Arthur ate, bringing some much-needed color and life back to his pale face, I felt a deep sense of peace wash over my anxiety. Yes, I was risking my job, but looking at this fragile human being finally finding some warmth and safety, I knew deep in my soul I had made the right choice. I poured him a second cup of hot coffee and wrapped the remaining half of his sandwich tightly in that paper napkin, sliding it across the table toward him. "Take this with you for later," I smiled warmly. He nodded slowly, carefully placing the wrapped sandwich into his damp pocket like it was a bar of solid gold. He reached out and gently patted my hand. His skin was still cold, but his touch was incredibly gentle and full of gratitude. "You are a true angel," he whispered, a small, fragile smile finally appearing on his weathered face. In that beautiful, quiet moment, the raging storm outside didn't matter at all. My crushing poverty didn't matter. All that mattered was that two human beings had connected in the dark.
But my brief moment of peace was violently shattered by the loud sound of a door slamming open. I jumped up, spinning around in pure terror to see Mr. Henderson storming out of his office, his face turning an ugly, furious shade of purple. He had been watching the security cameras the entire time. He marched straight over to our booth, completely ignoring Arthur, and pointed a fat, angry finger directly at my face. "What do you think you are doing?" he screamed, his harsh voice echoing loudly in the empty diner. "Are you running a charity on my dime, Sarah? Are you stealing from my kitchen to feed the disgusting trash off the street?" I stepped in front of Arthur, trying desperately to shield the terrified old man from my boss's explosive wrath. "Mr. Henderson, please, he was freezing to death. I was going to pay for it out of my tips," I pleaded, my voice trembling with fear.
But Henderson was not a man who listened to reason, logic, or basic human compassion. He was furious that his authority had been challenged in his own restaurant. "You don't have any tips, and you don't have a job anymore," Henderson roared, slamming his fist down heavily on the table, making the coffee cups jump and spill. "Get your stuff and get out of my restaurant, now. Both of you get out." Marcus came running out of the kitchen, frantically trying to intervene and save me. "Boss, come on, she is a good worker. It was just one little sandwich," Marcus pleaded, putting himself between me and the angry manager. But Henderson immediately turned his blind rage on him, threatening to fire him too if he spoke another word. I looked at Marcus and shook my head sadly. I couldn't let my only friend lose his livelihood because of my choices. I untied my apron with shaking hands.
I threw the apron onto the counter, accepting my grim fate. I helped Arthur to his feet, guiding the frightened old man toward the front door. We stepped out into the freezing rain together. The brutal cold hit me like a physical blow, but the sudden panic setting in my mind was worse. I had just lost my income, and I had absolutely no idea how I was going to survive. I walked with Arthur to the nearby bus stop, which offered a tiny bit of shelter. I had exactly 2 bus tokens left in my pocket, my only way home. I gave them both to him without hesitation. A late-night city bus pulled up to the curb. I helped him on board, begging the driver to make sure he stayed safe. As the bus pulled away, Arthur raised his hand in a thankful wave. I stood alone in the freezing rain, crying uncontrollably. I walked 3 miles back to my apartment, my mind racing with pure terror. The next few months were an absolute nightmare.
Finding a job was incredibly difficult after getting fired for supposedly stealing food. Word traveled fast among local managers, and no one would hire me. I lost my apartment within 2 short months. I had to sell almost everything I owned just to afford a miserable room in a boarding house on the worst side of town. The heating never worked, and I cried myself to sleep almost every single night. The heavy guilt and constant fear were a terrible burden. But whenever I remembered the look of pure gratitude on Arthur's face, I knew I couldn't regret it. I refused to give up completely. I started working 3 different exhausting part-time jobs just to stay afloat. I cleaned houses in the morning, worked a cash register in the afternoon, and washed dishes at a bakery at night. I forced myself to save every spare penny I earned. After 2 brutal years of non-stop work and extreme penny pinching, I had saved enough money to buy a beat-up second-hand food cart. I started selling breakfast sandwiches near the downtown office buildings. I woke up at 3 in the morning every single day, prepping ingredients in my tiny kitchen. I applied the exact same love I gave Arthur to every single meal I made. I greeted every customer with a massive, genuine smile. Slowly but surely, the line at my little food cart began to grow longer. 3 years into running the cart, my life took a major turn. I had saved enough profit to finally rent a small brick-and-mortar space. It was a tiny cafe on a quiet, tree-lined street, but it was all mine. And the very first person I hired was Marcus. He had quit Mr. Henderson's diner, unable to stand the toxic environment any longer. Having him by my side felt like a huge victory. For the first time in my entire life, I felt truly secure. But life has a funny, cruel way of testing you just when you think you are finally safe. Just as my small cafe was hitting its 5-year anniversary, a massive corporate real estate firm bought the entire block of buildings where my cafe was located. A week later, I received a cold, formal letter in the mail. It was a notice of a massive rent increase, almost triple what I was currently paying, effective at the end of the month. It was a blatant tactic to force all the small businesses out. The deadline approached fast. It was a gloomy Thursday afternoon, pouring rain outside, ironically similar to the night I met Arthur. The cafe was empty. I was standing behind the counter, trying hard not to cry. That is exactly when the sleek black town cars pulled up to the curb. I watched in absolute dread as the landlord stepped out. The tall man in the dark, incredibly expensive suit walked in. He looked around the cafe, and his piercing eyes locked onto me. I stepped out from behind the counter, ready to beg for more time. "Are you Sarah?" the man asked. I nodded, pleading for mercy. He didn't say a word about the rent. Instead, he reached into his jacket and placed that faded, crinkled diner napkin on the wooden counter between us. I looked down, incredibly confused, until the memory hit me. "Where did you get this?" I stammered. The man's tough exterior melted away. His eyes filled with heavy tears. "My name is David," he said. 5 years ago, my father, Arthur, was diagnosed with severe Alzheimer's. He wandered off during a terrible storm. We were terrified he was going to freeze. The police found him the next morning. In his pocket, he was tightly clutching this exact napkin with half a sandwich inside. "He forgot his own life, but he never forgot you. He kept this napkin on his nightstand every day," David continued, overflowing with gratitude. "He passed away 2 months ago. When I took over his company, I saw your name on the eviction list. I hired an investigator. When I found out you were fired from a diner 5 years ago, on the exact night my father went missing, I knew I had found the angel who saved his life." I burst into tears. David handed me a thick folder. "I am not here to collect rent, Sarah. I bought this building, and I am transferring the deed completely over to you. The cafe, the apartments, the entire property is yours, free and clear." My knees gave out. I collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Marcus rushed over, hugging me tightly. The nightmare was finally over. The crushing weight of poverty I had carried for 5 agonizing years evaporated. David smiled warmly, picked up the old napkin, and placed it back into his pocket. "Thank you, Sarah. Keep making those amazing sandwiches," he whispered before walking out the door. Today, my cafe is the most popular spot in the neighborhood. We serve hot meals, and anyone who comes to my door hungry gets fed. Looking back, the pain of losing my job and being homeless was terrifying, but it taught me a lesson I will carry forever. True kindness is never wasted. When you plant a seed of compassion in the darkest of storms, you never know how beautifully it might bloom years down the road. I risked everything to help a stranger, and in the end, that stranger saved me. Tell me, if you were in my shoes that rainy night, knowing you would lose your job, would you do the same thing and feed the old man? I would love to read your honest thoughts in the comments. Until the next story.